Okay, so now we're at soldering practice, and this is also for your soldering inspection, right? I have to inspect your work before you're approved to move on to building your circuit board. So in your kit somewhere you have a small green circuit board like this. Yours might be a little bit fatter, depends on which ones I decide to give out. Yours might look something like this, it doesn't matter. You have a small circuit board and you've got a very long set of pins like this, right? So what I want you to do is you're going to put that long set of pins in that circuit board. Oops, you're going to connect the small ends, right? You notice that there's a small end here and a big end, right? The long end and the small end, and you're going to put the small end through one edge of your circuit board. Right? It doesn't matter which side you use because it's the same. The circuit board's the same on both sides. Right, so you have the small pins all the way through the circuit board, and your soldering inspection is to make sure that each one of these pins is soldered into this circuit board. Now this circuit board is just for practice. So you have these in your kit. They are for practice. Any team member who's going to solder on the circuit board must complete this thing. Right? So if you're doing it and you're passing your kit off to somebody else, ask me for another practice circuit board because you have to be certified to solder in order to complete that step. Now just one more thing before we get started. You have several of these pins in your kit. You have some smaller ones like this that actually go onto the circuit board. That's not the one for practice. You have a 3-pin that I've already actually built with, but you don't want to use that one. You're going to use the really long one, and it's going to have at least 20 pins on it, right? It might even have 25 pins on it, right? So you want to use that one. That's the one that you have to use in order to do the practice in order to get certified in soldering. So what I want to make sure that you have is that you put it in to the circuit board so that the small pins are coming out and the big pins are sticking out the side of the circuit board, because that's how you would connect something into this circuit board. Okay, so I've got my pins in my circuit board and I haven't soldered anything yet. What I'm going to do is take a little bit of the flux paste here, right? And I'm just going to touch at each one of those little brass circles on there, right? Touch right down there and put a little bit of flux. I'm going to do the first like 4 of them here, and you can do more as you move on. I'm going to show you a method for soldering that will probably help you. Okay, so I got flux on the first 4 pins there. And now I'm going to do something that I call tinning the tip of my soldering iron here. So the first thing I'm going to do is going to clean the tip of my soldering iron off. I'm just going to use my needle nose pliers here, and not too hard, just kind of gently. Just clean off any excess solder that's on there. Any stuff. You definitely don't want to touch this with your hand if it's plugged in, because it is hot. So I use the tip of my needle nose pliers there and just kind of gently take off any loose solder that's on there. Then I'm going to take my solder and touch it to the tip of my soldering iron so that there is now solder on my soldering iron. And you see you got a little bit of a bubble of solder on there, right? That's called tinning the soldering iron, right? And I'm going to hold my circuit board down and I'm just going to touch that tip of the soldering iron right there to that little pin, right? And what's going to happen is the flux is going to melt and that solder that's on there is going to transfer itself directly onto the pin. Just hold it there for a couple seconds. And then you see it just go right on there. So I'm going to try to move this up so you can see it a little bit better. To adjust the camera here so you can see. Oops, you can see how. Just as closer. You can see how that little bubble of solder is right there, right over that pin. Right. So that's how you do it. I'm gonna do it again so you can see it. Okay. Take my soldering iron. Get some solder on the edge of it here, on the end of it. And so I've got just a little tiny bubble of solder on there. Not a lot, right? If it's dripping off, it's too much. and then I'm just going to touch it right to the pin here, and just give it a second and let the pin heat up, let the flux melt, and the solder will transfer itself right to the pin and to the little copper circle there. And sometimes it takes a little, sometimes you gotta do it on both sides. It takes a little bit of practice to do, and that's okay. That's why we're doing this. Now I've made a mistake here. I want to show you what I did. I let the pin get a little bit too hot, and you see how that's now off there. See how that pin is off, and then I soldered it in place, so it's kind of stuck there now. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to have to heat that back up, right, and move that back into place. Now I've got to be real careful because it's hot. What happened is I melted the plastic a little bit, so I'm just going to melt the solder a little bit here, and just gently with my fingernail move that back over into place. And it's really hot, so let me do it this way. And if you mess this up, you know, just one or two of them here, it's not the end of the world. I'm going to show you how to fix it though. You just heat the solder back up a little bit. Let's give it a minute here, and then move that back into place once the solder's heated. It doesn't take a whole lot. The solder gets warm pretty easily. There, now that's back into place. Okay, so what I want you to do is to do all 20 or 25, depending on how long the thing is that I give you. Practice. You will get so much better at it with each time. By the time you're down here to the other end, you'll just be doing them real quick, right? So I'll do it a third time for you here. I'm gonna have flux already on there. Let me just do put a little bit more flux on there. Let's get a little bit of flux here, and just barely touch it to the pin and the little metal part. Wherever the flux goes, that's where the solder is going to go. So as the flux melts, it'll go right down in there, and it'll let the solder go right in there. So I'm going to get a little bit of solder on the tip of my soldering iron, and I'm going to touch it to the pin of the circuit board here. And just give it a minute. I don't want to push too hard, so then I don't have the same problem I did a minute ago. Just let the flux melt, let the solder melt, let it do its thing. You'll see that it'll go right into place there. There you go. Doesn't take much, it just takes a little bit of patience. You don't want to push real hard. You don't want to force it in there. There you go. A little flux on the end of my soldering iron. Sometimes it helps to move it back and forth a little bit to heat everything up. Sometimes you just sit it in one spot and it'll heat up enough that the solder will go right on there. You can tell once you've got it soldered. Now it's real important that your solder doesn't touch from one circle to the other. So that's one of the things I'm going to be looking for when I inspect it. Right, is that your solder is only in one spot. Right, you don't want them grouped together because then they're connected together from a circuit standpoint. All right, finish all those up, and then that'll be ready for your solder inspection.